Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Shake your head if you can. All right, I see some heads bobbing. It's great to be here despite or because of the tumultuous times we live in. It's great to be able to connect and to be able to share some of the work we've been doing at the Lindy Institute as well as in the Urban Strategy Program. I'm Harris Steinberg, the Executive Director of the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation, and I'd like to welcome you to Urban Strategy in the Present Tense. Over the past few years, I've been excited to support the development of Drexel's Urban Strategy Program, which is a master's degree, into a hub for critical thinking, engaged scholarship, and ethical inquiry about cities. I believe that the Urban Strategy Program represents Drexel at its best, combining in-class education with experiential civic engagement to advance the careers of emerging urban innovators. This series, which we're kicking off today, is designed to showcase the kinds of approaches and solutions that constitute the urban strategy approach. What better way to kick us off than a conversation with Michael O'Brien, a Lindy Institute Urban Innovation Fellow, who has contributed so much to the civic conversation in Philadelphia, as well as exemplifying the same kind of values as the Urban Strategy Program. It has been a pleasure to get to know Michael over the past few years and see him advance his own practice. With that, I will turn the program over to Urban Strategy Program Director Andrew Zitzer, who will guide us through the rest of today.
Thank you, Harris, and thank you so much to everyone for coming this afternoon. I'm just going to ask for a couple of ground rules. We just want to have everyone leave themselves muted for the duration of the call. What we're going to do is take questions and answers when we've finished the interviewing portion between me and Michael. And what we'll ask you to do at the time that your question arises is just put it in the chat box. And we have Ryan Diebold from the Lindy Institute. Thank you, Ryan, moderating the chat. And he will and I will come up with the questions that we'll ask Michael on your behalf. We expect the call to last an hour. And we'll start off with a little bit of introductory material on Mike, and then we'll do a little bit of an interview, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And then finally, I'll just say a few words about the Urban Strategy Master's Program before we wrap up. So once again, thank you. But before we get the main part of the call underway, I just want to address the violence and the unrest that has gripped Philadelphia and the nation over the last week. For me, urban strategy is fundamentally about problem setting, even more than problem solving. In order to think about solutions, we first need to understand the historical, cultural, economic, and political underpinnings of any given situation. And though these issues are more complicated than I have time to cover in depth, I want to acknowledge that Black, Indigenous, and people of color in America have been marginalized in countless ways through land seizure, racist housing practices, economic discrimination, and state-supported violence. Just 2 days ago, the New York Times highlighted a few of the ways that Black Americans in particular have been disproportionately affected by the effects of the last few months, the events of the last few months. They are more likely to lose jobs and income in the coronavirus recession. They have less accumulated wealth, which leads to greater vulnerability in riding out the economic hardships that we're about to face. A higher percentage of Black Americans are working as frontline essential workers as a percentage of all employees. And for this and other reasons, they are dying at higher rates from the coronavirus than white Americans. I mention all of this to say that the problems we face this week are long in their development, a slow disaster, to use our Drexel colleague Scott Knowles' phrase. It is incumbent upon us to not only understand this, but to change it. For me, that begins with a personal and public acknowledgement that Black lives matter. They matter whether it is George Floyd dying at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. They matter when it is a young child who faces chronic health problems because of environmental pollutants disproportionately affecting his neighborhood. They matter when subpar schooling threatens a teen girl's chance to achieve an economically secure future based on a world-class education, and much more. This series is called Urban Strategy in the Present Tense. These people's lives matter in the present tense, in the past tense, and in the future tense. So that is why it is such a privilege today to be in conversation with Michael O'Brien, an activist, educator, and entrepreneur who works at the very center of these questions and is driving these solutions. Michael O'Brien is an expert practitioner and researcher in the fields of community development, organizational culture, and human well-being, who has spent more than a decade working directly with resilient yet underserved populations, including veterans, adults in recovery, returning citizens, and families experiencing homelessness. He was selected as an Innovation Fellow by the Lindy Institute at Drexel University in 2017. Since 2015, he has served as the Director of Learning at the Village of Arts and Humanities, a nonprofit headquartered in North Philadelphia. He is also a Corzo Fellow at the Corzo Center for the Creative Economy at the University of the Arts. He is the founder of HD2 Solutions, a consultancy working with nonprofits, businesses, local government agencies, and their employees to transform how they understand and support human development, interaction, and performance. Clients include NeighborWorks America, Artists Year, New Jersey Community Capital, and Saxby's Coffee. O'Brien has spoken nationally about his work, including convenings at Cornell University, the Urban Consulate, the Viralist Center for Arts and Politics at the New School, the Sphinx Music Conference, and the famed Apollo Theater in New York. O'Brien holds a bachelor's degree in music from the University of the Arts and a graduate certificate in childhood trauma studies from Jefferson University. He is a faculty member of the Career Studies Department at the Curtis Institute of Music and serves on the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Arts. He currently serves on the boards of two philanthropic institutions, the Samuel S. Fells Fund and the Philadelphia Cultural Fund, and is every day inspired by exploring the science of art humanity. Welcome, Michael O'Brien.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here.
So, yeah, so many familiar faces, right? I wanted to kick off by asking you to talk about the way that the present and the past intersect in the work that you do.
Yeah, I think that the best way for me to do that would be to actually read something very shortly that I wrote back in February for the Inquirer as a part of a larger op-ed for Black History Month, looking at the conversation around human well-being and wellness and health. I'm going to read that really quickly. It's called Respect for Black Humanity. For Black communities in the Philadelphia region and the country at large, our humanity has been in question since the moment the conquest of Africa and Africans became a dominant goal for colonial powers. From that vantage point, centuries of policy, cultural practices, and economic activities have prioritized the well-being and posterity of a white majority. Redlining, the GI Bill, the Tuskegee experiment, lynching and other forms of racist violence, differences in life expectancy by zip code, enormous wealth gaps, all of these issues have their roots in a denial of the humanity of Black people. Wellness for these communities, for our communities, for Black communities, will require full recognition from every level of power, both public and private, that Black humanity is an irrefutable contributor to what has become known as American identity and deserves to be honored as such. Second, if we are to create wellness, we must first recognize that wellness demands the proper resources, activities, and financial backing. Wellness will not just happen because people will it into existence. We can therefore think of concepts like neighborhood wellness as an outcome that requires what developmental science calls a biopsychosocial spiritual framework. That is a framework that considers physical, psychological, social, and spiritual health all together. It is my hope that in the 21st century, we as a region will begin to challenge our policy frameworks as they relate to the posterity of Black families and communities. Thriving is a human right, as is the experience of joy. I maintain hope that we will collectively work to achieve these rights for Black people, as well as Indigenous Americans, migrants, undocumented children, and all other humans in this region. I want to offer that as some context for the conversation we're going to have today, and also for some context as to my thoughts about what we are experiencing locally and nationally, and some sense making, right, that might need to take place for us to really see and iterate a way forward. But in terms of connections to the past and present, to be non-scripted for a moment, we are seeing a disconnect in the narrative around our history, the narrative around our humanity, the narrative around the ways that these problems have come to be. We are experiencing a disconnect currently in an understanding of the interconnectedness of individuals and their beliefs and their core sense of identity to larger macro systems and policy, because it is individuals and collections of small groups of individuals that create policy on behalf of the masses. And I think what we're experiencing right now is a lot of miscommunication and a lot of exchanges of emotion. And I think that if we're not careful, we will mistake moments of silence and rest for problem solving, and we have to be very careful.
So in the spirit of talking about wellness as a right and joy as a component of wellness, you recently called on the city of Philadelphia to consider racism and poverty to be declared public health emergencies. So can you talk a little bit about the implications of what that might mean?
Yes, so public health is a fascinating construct, right? It looks at the well-being of large populations, right? You're not talking about one or two people. You're talking about thousands upon hundreds of thousands and millions of people, and having to consider their well-being, challenges, disease, all kinds of things in that space. And actually there's another term, population health, that goes hand in hand with public health, right? And they often are kind of merging back and forth in the context of the work in the field. And the thing about public health is that it actually has structures. It has clear structures for thinking about and organizing these larger issues that are at play and at and dynamically involved in someone's well-being, right? In fact, the terminology typically used now is the social determinants of health. And just to name a couple of them, you know, economic stability, which includes things like employment, income, expenses, debt, medical bills, just what kind of support economically do you have in terms of family or friends and network. It also includes things like your neighborhood or your physical environment. So things like housing stock. How, you know, in Philadelphia, for example, there's a lot of moldy housing stock. How does transportation work? Safety, parks, playgrounds, walkability, community and social context is another one. And this is where racism comes into play, because in the context of social determinants of health, they name specifically discrimination, stress, social integration. So there are a number of things. Food is in this space as well. There are a number of clearly identified places of concern for both individuals and families, and therefore whole neighborhoods, and then the city at large, that would allow us to look at how has racism and the activity of structuring policy, access, procedures, operations, et cetera, around someone's skin color or ethnicity, how has that complicated someone's ability to access housing fairly? How's it complicated their ability to access fair educational services? To your point, Andrew, in that beautiful opening, which I'm, you know, super grateful for you, you know, explicitly talking like that. This, when we call something a crisis, we, in the public health context, we now get to utilize tools to organize, but then also tools to start naming and iterating potential solutions. So the other thing about public health is that the way they think about intervention and prevention is in a tripart model. So you have primary prevention, you have secondary prevention, and then you have tertiary prevention or interventions, right? And all three of them are based on this idea that people are at varying forms of risk for varying kinds of issues. And so there's a, you know, primary group where you're going to deal with everybody, so it's general risk. There's that secondary group, which is going to look at people at most at risk of experiencing X or Y thing. And then you have that tertiary group where it's the people who are directly experiencing that problem right now. And you're going to divvy up intervention strategies, prevention strategies. You're going to divvy up funds and resources differently based on who's falling into what area. And so I think those can be really healthy starting places when we're trying to address issues of structural racism that cut across so many areas of human well-being: education, food access, jobs, money, income, the whole nine. That's just a quick reason why I'm into that idea. I can go on, but stop.
Well, how might the city of Philadelphia look different if that model were the dominant paradigm, if you will, as opposed to the way it looks now? And feel free to reference your own work sort of at the vanguard of making structural changes to systems as maybe pointing us towards a future, if you will.
Sure, yeah. At the vanguard, I appreciate you. Hopefully I'm at the vanguard or close enough to it, right? So a couple of thoughts, right? We talk about implicit bias. We talk about explicit bias a lot. People go to trainings, etc. And there's this phrase or common refrain I hear, know your biases. That's a catch-22 because implicit biases are unconscious bias. The biases that exist underneath our layer of conscious knowing, it's a catch-22. You actually can't know them all. So I'll give you a quick example. As a man raised in a society where men are lifted to a status of power and dominance, even being a Black man, I still have the benefit of being a man, and a cis man at that I identify with the gender that I was assigned at birth. That kind of power dynamic and being reared in a world that reinforces that men should be aggressive in certain ways and going after what you want and getting what you need. And we get socialized to ideas around roles that women should have. Even if we don't necessarily agree with them from very early ages, we're getting socialized to those ideas. And the way implicit or unconscious bias works is that whatever you get socialized to over time has some sticky residue in that space of unconscious processing that you're not going to be able to just like eradicate or pull out of your system. If we were to recognize that as a whole, right? I'm just talking about myself as a man. If I recognize that as a whole, then if I have I do have a company, right? And I then have to think about where in my operations, procedures, policies, and practices and my budget might I be doing things that could be considered sexist or influenced by sexist ideas, even if I didn't intend to do that, right? It doesn't matter if I have daughters. It doesn't matter if I have a wife. It doesn't matter if I have a mom. Like none of those things matter because you can be in relationship with people and still practice forms of operationalized bias, which in the context of a race, we would call racism. Right? In the context of gender, we would call sexism. So we first have to release the idea that we can all know our biases and then accept that that means we need to be in a constant state of practice of reviewing budgets, reviewing policy, reviewing operations, assessing for outcomes and impacts, seeing if what we intend to happen is actually happening, and with the best of intentions, if it's not happening, be willing to make course correction, which also might mean that we need to involve the voices of the people most impacted and stop trying to empower people and actually practice sharing power with people. We will spend lots of money on logic models to try to figure out over a 3-year period how to empower someone versus looking at the inventory of privilege and power, resources, and access that I or my organization or this institution has, and then go, how do I just simply share the power that I have with this person or with this group? How do we work together on this thing? How do we move people into positions of operationalized power now, as opposed to this longitudinal idea of waiting 2 to 3 years with really pretty logic models, really pretty theories of change before we're then ready to do something. I think if we were to declare racism a public health issue, it would speed up some of that process and get into a bunch of the nitty gritty of what I just talked about. I didn't talk about my work though, but it's implied, I guess.
Well, what I like about what you're saying is that it's both a lens, an optical overview that changes the way that everything looks, and it's also a science. It's a science of systematically rooting out the things that oppress and the things that marginalize, and that we, and I'll put myself in this same category, are often so bound up in our own narrative and our own privilege and our own lens that it's hard to do that work of course correction and systematically sort of changing dynamics. So maybe to push it back to you to talk more about your own work, are there ways in which you feel that with the various hats you wear, you're beginning to undo some of this received wisdom?
I hope, right? Like, I mean, I think, I really hope. I'll talk about some of the work I'm doing around employment because or income access is really how I like to phrase it. Sometimes I even say access to family sustaining wages, right? I think sometimes we need to be extra clear and purposeful with our language so that we can begin to demystify or just further refine what the goal is, right? The goal of creating income is to generate the things in your life that bring well-being for either you or your family, right? Or your loved ones, right? People you care about. And so in that context, one of the things that I've recognized, having studied the human body a lot and how brains develop and work and our social nature as a species and an organism, and also studying the myths about our development, our humanity and our human development process. What I've gained out of all of that reading and digging is that when it comes to things like hiring, voting works the same way. Even the way we think about discipline and operationalize it, you tend to go or be kinder to the things that you like and to the things that you can easily resonate with and identify with. And there's a lot of interesting research around empathy as a construct, right? We don't have a static definition for empathy. So some researchers will define empathy as being able to resonate with the emotional experience of another person. Other researchers will define it as both having the resonance and being motivated to do something on behalf of another person. It's not just the feeling, right? And you got other definitions in that space, but what's fascinating across the board is that the recognition of another person's humanity in terms of their emotional endeavors and experiences and projecting into their world and being able to identify with some of their stuff, very hard to do across stark differences like race and gender, etc. So when I think about hiring, disciplinary processes within orgs, who gets fired, particularly in Pennsylvania, where you have at-will employment, which means that an excuse that's both accessible and permissible in that world is you're not a good culture fit. I want to unpack all that. What does that mean? What does it mean I'm not a culture fit? I don't look like someone you go get a beer with. I don't feel like your frat buddy. Like, what does that mean when the dominant majority of the folks in position to hire or maneuver people through a workforce development system are white, when the entrepreneurial system here is overwhelmingly white? Like, what does it mean then for me to not be a cultural fit? And people don't like to dig into that. So got a project that got a bit of a redesign because of COVID-19. And so we've been, my business and the Village of Arts and Humanities, where I'm employed, have been funded to partner on a really interesting learning endeavor. It's a professional learning community made up of 3 distinct stakeholder groups. One is employers, and that kind of splits into 2 sub areas: people doing immediate hires, and then people who are looking to hire over the next 6 to 18 month window or horizon. The second group are funders, and not just traditional philanthropy. We're looking at social impact investors, and I've been talking, they're really interested in some of this work that I'm going to describe in a second. So people that have money to put a capital to invest in this idea of the work of the future, or future systems around workforce development. And then the third group are our residents, our neighbors, particularly from some of the neighborhoods that have been hit hardest by things like COVID-19, or where the uprisings have taken place. And I call them uprisings and rebellions. I know some people use the term riots. I call them uprisings and rebellions because people are fed up with being poor and hungry and forgotten and left alone. If I could really quickly, just quick detour, I'm gonna get back to the work. I wanna share a quick little story from a buddy of mine who I think is on this call, Brandon, shout out to Brandon Payne. His friend, who's a lawyer, was out with his kids and saw people engaging in activities that folks call looting. And he engaged that young man, who couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years of age, and asked him why he was doing what he was doing, and really was more concerned about his safety than the clothes, right? Which I appreciate. And the young man said, "Oh, head, nobody cares about us anyway. I'm gonna die young. I'm probably gonna die soon. I might as well die wearing fly stuff." If that isn't indicative of the moment that we're in, that's not just this present moment, but longitudinally a part of an entire world where employment and income access is a huge problem. the income to access your needs or to address your needs, right? So for me, having residents who feel like that, involved in mirror learning between these three groups, employers, funders, and then again, residents, right, young and old. They do individualized learning in this construct, about 5 different sessions, learning about human development, learning about like group and systems theory, right? And the goal in all of this is to put this in language that people get. And it's all reflective on workplaces, workspaces, what's going to help us make resilient workspaces for the future in the face of automation. We're talking about a lot of stuff, not to make experts, but to get people some general vocabulary so we can have some shared language, develop some shared views and values around our humanity and around human development from a science-informed perspective that clearly highlights and centers identity as a part of our constructs. That identity is not just race, but race is a huge part of that. And so when you start to talk about intersectionality, this gets complex. We don't need to run from complexity. We need to sit in it and embrace it and literally sit in it. That's why this is a 12-month-long learning community. So over 5 sessions, mirror learning, even learning around what we call courageous conversations. Well, not we, there's a model called Courageous Conversations, built to help people have intergroup dialogue across all kinds of stark identity points, race, gender, etc. So they get all that training over the course of 5 months, and then we start combining people to have this dialogue with each other and looking to see how can we iterate spaces and places and accessibility into work and income that 1, has upward mobility, 2, has some longevity, and 3, is centered on the human well-being of the employees who are coming in, but also the employees who are already there. Because here's the dope part. If we were to take care of Black people the way that they deserve with the fullness of the dignity of their humanity, we would inadvertently be taking care of everybody else too, point blank, right? There's no way around that. Martin Luther King used to always say that essentially the humanity of the world, the well-being of the world is tied up in this terse relationship in the Western world between Black people and the majority. And if they get it right, if we would get it right, we could alleviate suffering for all people. The question is, do we want to invest in that? And so this is a starting place. That project is a starting place centered around income and economic development for individuals and families, bringing in constituencies and stakeholders who don't typically talk to each other, and not in that, kind of trifecta, and seeing what happens. It's a learning process and a little bit of a research process with some doing involved. Hopefully that was clear. I know there was a freaking lot.
Well, one of the things that I think would be easy to say in that model of the learning community is that the benefit would accrue to the neighborhood people who would be better successful at getting and keeping jobs, because that's a deficit model of thinking, that there's something pathologized and wrong with them, that if we do training with them, that they would be better positioned for the marketplace as we have constructed it. But could you talk a little bit about what the benefits are for the funders and the employers in a model like that when you talk about our shared humanity?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the premise that you just laid out is exactly why I designed it the way I did, and why I even started working with employers, and organizations some years ago. I got sick of people being like, oh, we got to teach all the Black people soft skills. We got to teach the young Black people how to code switch. And again, going back to my examples of you're not a good culture fit or blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, what does that even mean? And what's it like as a Black person, as a Black man, as a Black woman, as a Mexican man or woman, right? Because it's not just Black people who have to go through this in the workplace. What's it like when you have to make yourself safe for other people 24/7? And have to keep constantly guessing, constantly trying to figure it out, not step on eggshells, blah, blah, blah. That's hyper stressful. And so I said, somebody's got to deal with the organizational culture, and somebody's got to deal with the learning curve that is not being scaled for these managers, middle managers, C-suite folks, owners, board folks, right? Like someone's got to do that work too. And not that nobody was, it was just so mismatched, right? The ratio was just completely off. And so the benefits for employers, in fact, I'll sum it up through a quote from an employer and a training that I did as a part of a pilot with United Way and a couple of other local partners focusing on opportunity youth, young people 14 to 26. This one employer said, you know what? This is just good for all of my employees. Like, I get why this is good for these 14 to 26-year-olds who might have had experiences with foster care, et cetera. But as you're going through these modules, I keep thinking about my 45-year-old employee who's a white mom in South Philly, or I'm thinking about this 50-year-old Black employee. I'm not thinking about the 14 to 26-year-olds or just, you know, the kids who we are labeling as troubled. I'm not, like, this is good for everybody, right? And I think that's what you get out of it, is you get a wider connotation personally around what it means to be human and what it means to have to perform in the context of a system that is inadvertently stressful, creating stress, even when it doesn't mean to. What is it? I think employers and funders also begin to understand how their dollars could better be spent. There's a lot of research we share coming from like the HR world, et cetera. There was this fascinating research that went down in the HR world, and, you know, make a long story short, roughly on average for an employee at any firm, they're losing, an employer is losing about 15 hours roughly of time from their the employee's productivity. So it's not absenteeism, it's another term called presenteeism. And they found out that the 15 hours was mostly being lost in financial woes. Can you fire people over not being able to focus because they're just not getting paid enough, or came in with a debt ratio that was way too high for what they're making and their financial woes are stressing them out, or a medical emergency occurs and they have to figure out life? Like, no. So people had to do really different things that started to attune to the humanity of the people in those roles within the org, and productivity went up, blah, 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 blah. But it was a different take for those organizations who were involved in the direct application part of the study. They did a much more longitudinal dive to be able to get to this statistically valid number around how many hours the average employee at any size firm is generally losing in terms of their presenteeism, right? And so these are just some of the things that I think funders and employers get to learn by doing this kind of work.
Michael, one of the things I hear is a theme in what you're talking about is undergirding our common humanity, and that the notion that we have a duty to support the humanity of Black people is not separate from our duty to understand ourselves as deeply in need of the joy and the thriving, and by ourselves, I say white people, because we all benefit from the kind of caretaking and the kind of different epistemology or different lens that can be shared. One of the things that I know you involve yourself with a lot is arts and creativity. And to me, that's an important part of thriving and the life well lived. So can you talk a little bit over the trajectory of your career of how arts and creativity filters in to this notion of a good life?
Yeah, so anyone that knows me knows I love art, all forms of art. I wish that I was a better visual artist, but I'm not, alas. But I really, in my true nerdy self, I'm going to lead with a piece of research. So fascinating research done looking at pretty large groups of young folks and older folks and art making and measurements around their psychological health and well-being. And then also, the most important one to me is looking at stress reduction by measuring cortisol levels in the body. And that's the study I'm going to talk about real quick. So long story short, what they were able to determine is that even if you did not like making art, it still lowered the cortisol levels in your body. Making art is a de-stressful activity, regardless of if you like it, right? And they repeated that study. And it was a fascinating read to me. I was like, man, art is just this gift that keeps on giving and supports our human development in ways that over-commercialization and over-utilitarian notions around art might be completely detracting from in this moment. And by this moment, I mean over the last 50 years, right? As the music industry and other, forms of commercialized art have really grown and become a thing. You know, now I'm in a world where young people might say to staff at the village, or have said to me in the past, I know to my face, like, oh, well, I don't really want to try to sing in class because I don't sing like Beyonce. And it's like, well, that's not the requirement here. No one's giving you a record deal. We want you to have fun and be in a process and make, right? We don't really care about how well you sing, right? Some of the worst singers write some of the best songs, right? Because it's not about just being able to carry a tune. And so I bring all that up because that's the underpinning of the arts to me. It's like, it is healthy for all people to be involved in art making, regardless of what happens with the product. In fact, the product doesn't really even matter because it's the process that distresses you. Don't get me wrong, the product has value even beyond just its commercial utilitarian value. But again, back to ratios, does the product matter more than the process? No. And so for me, as a maker, as a thinker, as a creative, what became important was to make sure that I use art as a tool for inquiry and a tool for just like figuring stuff out, doing some sense making and synthesizing, and then also using it as a tool for sharing or dissemination or for putting things out into the world. So I might make more things than people ever see, but that's because it's for me and because I understand the benefits of art making. And I literally try to share that across all my projects with anybody. So back to the project around economic development and jobs, they're going to be doing some art making with each other, by themselves, because, and to the point around why I believe art is so powerful, there's really interesting research around the brain and imagination, and tons of interesting research. It's all been called recently in a book. I feel like I've been waiting for this book for 30 years. I'm 34. All that being said, there's really interesting information about how the brain imagines in the context of distancing or distance. So it turns out that it looks like the brain will think about or imagine in words in relationship to anything that is physically, socially, or psychologically, or dare I even say emotionally, distant from that person. Again, physical, social, or psychological / emotional. If something or someone is distant from you in any of those three categories, you will reason with them in regards to like using words. Anything close to you physically, socially, psychologically, or emotionally, you will reason with through picture and metaphor. What people need to understand about the power of art and art making, one of the reasons why I believe from a bio and physiological end that art making, whether or not you like it, will lower stress levels, cortisol levels in the body, is because what we've been able to discover by observing the body in states of making is that the parts of our brain that we used to call the emotional brain are completely subsumed in the art making process. In fact, brains are fascinating because it's not just one part controlling one thing, it's multiple parts of your brain firing together and that have been wired together through experience, that multiple parts are firing at the same time to facilitate anything, like me talking with my hands moving, etc. And so when we think about art making, the emotional parts of the brain being involved, and metaphor and picture being ways that the brain imagines with things that are close to you, I see this as a doorway into working with people. So if I can get people to not focus on their differences between race, but start to focus on their commonality and emotional experiences, joy, awe, wonder, or some of the negative ones, powerlessness, fear, terror, shame, feeling like no matter whatever you do, nothing's gonna change. All of a sudden, if people can find commonality there, they might be able to reason with each other and about each other through picture and metaphor in deeper emotionally connective ways to then start to cross the schism around race or gender, etc. But I can do that with art. I don't know that I can do that well with words. But we've not found that words naturally connect to emotional parts of the brain. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen for lots of people because, you know, brains are uniquely wired and individual, but overarchingly, what we're finding is that when you're thinking about people with words, it tends to be the parts of your brain that think about abstract concepts like math, and people are not line items in a budget. point blank. And so we've got a big conundrum here, and this is why I am super fascinated about the ways that we can begin to use creativity and creative methods to help close some of these larger gaps that begin to chunk away at racism and blah, blah, blah. So I've been able to use that in a lot of my projects at the Village, through projects at Project Home. It was this great project we worked on called Journey to Home, all on the issue of youth homelessness and housing insecurity. That was a very long answer for why I love art, but I hope it made sense.
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate about you, Michael, and this is going to be my last question to you, so I want to let people know that if they have questions to ask for Mike, that they can put them in the chat, and I will selectively read them out. And we have about a little more than 15 minutes left in our call. But what I wanted to say was that you do such a good job of synthesis, that you bring together arts and economic development and youth empowerment and place and identity. And one of the things I feel bound to ask you as the director of a graduate program that's trying to teach people how to synthesize things across disciplines is, what are some moments in your own development that you have been inspired by mentorship or teaching or things that you've read that have taught you how to not just be an arts person or a youth person or an economic development person, but how to meld that own special path that is the path that we're trying to teach these urban strategy students how to go down? What are some inspiring moments for you?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. One, I'll speak these in like big chunks, be quick. Mentorship. I've been super fortunate to have people step in and go like, yes, I would love to like just support you in your development. I recognize that even as it's a bit of a form of privilege. If we had time to, I'd talk about why. But it is a form of privilege, but I appreciate having that opportunity, and I try to use it on behalf of other folks. But I have a lot of folks who have stepped in. There's a woman, Sandy Bloom, who is an amazing thinker. I mean, you talk about just 9 dimensions of thinking on a subject. She's fantastic. She's a psychiatrist and medical doctor and a trauma rock star in terms of like the trauma theory and teaching it and knowing it and the whole 9. She's been instrumental in my life. There's a woman, Susan Brotherton, also very, 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 very instrumental in my life. Jeremy Novak, I only got barely a year with him, but Jeremy changed my life and taught me to think about business in the context of my work and that it could be a tool for good. The other thing I would say is having friends, peers that support me and who I am and didn't ever try to tell me to be somebody else and encouraged all this and would listen to me when they couldn't even talk back to me about things that I had been reading, but they encouraged me to find more people, but always were listening. I think Latasha Morris might be on here, but we went to school together, fantastic artist and singer, never turned me off from talking about these things, even if she didn't know what to say back. And I think it's important that you curate people around you who are going to speak life into you, right, and support you. In terms of things I read, and this is the last thing I'll say, in terms of things I read, there's an article called We Feel, Therefore We Know by one of my favorite researchers and thinkers, Antonio Damasio. If you're into emotions, consciousness, and neurobiology, and the idea of like the self through a neurobiological lens, he's your guy. That article is fantastic and really changed my world. There's another article by another one of my favorite thinkers, John Powell. It's called Poverty Through a Belongingness Lens. Really impacted my life, really helped me reshape my world. And those 2 articles really helped me really understand how everything was connected. Sandy wrote an article called Trauma Theory Abbreviated, really helped me stay in that place of connectivity. Because at one point, people thought I was too scattered. And now my scatteredness is exactly what they want because it's not scattered.
We have 2 questions that have come in, and or maybe three now. So the first question was from Miriam Oppenheimer, who asked what you think of the Nordic model. And I don't know exactly what the Nordic model is, but if you know more about it, maybe you can say. I
don't know the Nordic model.
Miriam, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit?
I was going to type, but hi, I'm really happy to meet you guys. So like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, they're economics that fund arts tremendously, and they fund healthcare, and they fund things, you know, their taxes are sky high, but they get all this good stuff.
Yeah, so essentially, what do I think about taxes? So here's the thing about taxes and where we're at in the context of COVID-19. We decided not to tax land here for a very long time. And now we're in a situation, and so we rely on wage taxes disproportionately compared to a lot of other cities from what I've been gathering. You know, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've been seeing, it's pretty disproportionate. And now nobody's such a global statement. A lot of people are not working. And so we're not getting wage taxes and we don't have land taxes. We better do something. The Nordic model, the whomever model, we got to figure it out. So we either have to create a whole bunch of jobs and get people working, which means that we have to reskill and educate a lot of people, including people who were already in the market, the job market, people who weren't, people who were looking for entry, all of that, right? Or we're going to have to start taxing land and maybe even introduce other taxes. I don't know. The money's got to come from somewhere, right? Or someone's got to write some checks. Like there's no way around it. So I do appreciate the idea of healthy taxation. You know, we can't. This is the same parallel to the employer dilemma, at least to me. People want very human outputs, but don't have the inputs that produce the outputs. And I just kind of go like, we gotta do something. So I think it's the same deal. It's like, we want all these outputs, but we will not invest. It's not magic.
I'm going to keep rattling through a couple of questions while we have time. A question from Ariel Vasquez was, how would communities that have been affected most by mass incarceration move to achieve similar access to those that have not been incarcerated? And how would you go about working with employers to hire some folks from those communities? I know that you've specifically done work in this area.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I think we have to call racism a public health issue, because it starts to shift the onus of responsibility. It is not the responsibility of the disenfranchised to enfranchise themselves. Like that's backwards. They have been positioned to not have, again, going back to redlining and wealth suppression and wage suppression and unfair hiring practices. I mean, there's just all kinds of documented things that are clear as to why over a longitudinal sense of time, things became the way that they became. And so first is we all have to recognize that the idea of that community doing enough on its own with no resources outside of itself to bridge itself out of those problems, that's like throwing me in a 20-foot deep ditch and giving me a 3-foot, step stool and being like, can we do it? Can you do it? Let's empower you with chance. It's like, what? No, I need more feet. This isn't magic. I need more feet. I need a bigger ladder. So that's the first thing, right? And so when I think we flip the paradigm, then it is about, well, what are we doing to create opportunities for employers to understand their, I call it corporate social responsibility, when wage taxes are, this central to our government working and functioning well. We have a responsibility then to create jobs and have people hired if we need those taxes just to run city government. That's one. And then two, on the flip side of the folks who we're going to be bringing into some of this work, I think it's okay to teach people how to connect to work that connects to you personally, even if it's not your passion. That's fine, but we do need to be a little more specific about matching people to work in the context of the future of work and where our economy is going. You need jobs that are resilient in the face of automation. And the best thing is then, because jobs that are resilient in the face of automation are the jobs that are the jobs that robots can't replace in terms of humans. And so there's these core sets of human skills that really, creativity, abstract thinking, problem solving, conflict management, conflict resolution, blah, 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 blah. Matching people with skill sets, right, in that space to jobs that they actually want to do and learn and grow in, that can be done. And it can make for a much more fruitful endeavor over time.
I'm going to give the last question. Well, I'll just say we got a number of questions. I'm sorry I couldn't read them all. And one of the things that came up several times in the chat is that people would like a list of the references that you mentioned. So I'll work with you after the call to get a little bibliography going, because you know, as a professor, that makes my heart swoon that people want to keep on reading.
Sure.
But we're going to give the last question to Tawana Jones, who says, given our current state of uprising and rebellion, how do we move towards creating shared power? What are some first steps?
Nice question. And Tawana Jones is a rock star, by the way. You all should know her work by far. School psychologist, like I'm dead serious. If you want to understand what's happening with young people, understand the schools, please hit her up. Read the question one more time. I praised her so much, I forgot the question, please.
Given our current state of uprising and rebellion, how do we move towards creating shared power? What are some first steps?
Ooh, people got to learn how to hear each other. We are passing so much emotion back and forth, but we're not communicating. Like, we're talking, but we're not effectively communicating with one another. Like, I don't think understanding and meaning are being shared and passed back and forth to then build. So I think that, like, it sounds hokey, but the first step is we need some containers that allow people's voices to be heard, and we cannot silence or minimize or dismiss them because we cannot identify with their experiences, which therefore means that people in power, white people, men, we can think about other groups, we're gonna have to do a better job of listening. We're gonna have to do a job that says, first and foremost, I don't know everything, and it is possible that the way I've learned about this person's experience has been reduced to things like line items and budgets. And that is not who this is. This is a human being full of complexity. If I can leave you with a little wisdom from the continent of Africa, and also from a number of religions, and also from Judaism, right? There's this interesting trend in that area that people talk like this, that a human is equal to the sum, one human is equal to the sum of the entire universe. That's how much complexity is involved in that individual, in their makeup, in their constituency. And so it's easy to mishear people. So I think arts and artists can provide a really interesting container for that. Theater is the art of dialogue and listening and response and crafting things that are new together. And in the world that's hyper digital, where you can't have theater in the ways that we traditionally go and see theater happening, how can you take those same tools and repurpose them? This is where innovation comes from. Innovation happens when we blur the edges and blur things and use tools in new ways to accomplish means that were not originally intended for those tools, and or are bigger than the original intentionality of those tools. So, you know, you get that kind of answer from me as a creative, but it goes back to listening and people understanding that their first step in ceding power is to be quiet and to ask questions, compassionate inquiry, and to be willing to sit in the tension and then do something with what they're learning. This is not a quick fix, though. Like, everybody wants this all to be done in a week. That's not gonna happen, but we have to keep working at it daily. And I don't know that we've begun that work.
Well, I think that we are beginning the beginning of that work by having conversations like this one, hopefully among friends, but that will ripple out beyond just the group of friends and beyond the group of colleagues to the group of people who feel marginalized and outside and unheard and unseen. And I want to thank you for the insights that you've offered today, for the science that you've offered today, for the arts and the poetry that you've offered today. And I want to say that sort of going to this issue of sitting in the tension and asking questions, this is what Harris and I and others have created this Urban Strategy Master's program at Drexel to really be all about. And so I'm going to close our call before I advertise our next session that we're going to have in a month. I want to close our call by just letting people know that if they're interested in an academic experience that takes these questions seriously, that takes these values seriously, that is interested in compassionate and ethical inquiry, I invite you to look at Drexel's Urban Strategy program. It's a 2-year master's program at Drexel, where we focus on a core set of courses that everybody shares. We have a course called Civic Engagement and Participatory Methods that is all about the compassionate dialogue work that Michael is talking about, where we teach it as a side-by-side class, where half the people in the class are community members from West Philadelphia, and half are Drexel students learning community engagement side by side. We have classes on history and sociology and economics and public health. And so we're trying every day to integrate the models and the messages that we've discussed in our short time here today. It's a course that's very flexible. It allows you to customize your program and follow your own particular path. And finally, it's a course that really believes in mentorship and professional development for every single one of its students, that the Urban Strategy program takes seriously what Michael said about being privileged to have mentors and people who care, and a cohort of people around you who care. And I know some of my students are on this call and could speak to that, but I'll send out a link along with the references list that Mike will grace us with, to basically just say, if you're interested in learning more, you can speak to me at any time. We're still accepting applications for fall 2020. We will be convening again in this virtual space in a month. On July 1st at 4 p.m., we'll be back here with Chris Barr, who's the Executive Director of the Centennial Parkside CDC, and another of Drexel's Urban Innovation Fellows, and a friend of Mike's and a friend of mine. And we'll learn about the incredible work that he's doing in his community to try to bring solar power and jobs development to an area, a gorgeous and amazing area of Philadelphia on the edge of Fairmount Park that needs that support. So I want to invite everyone back. We'll announce that shortly and invite you all to register to be back here with us in a month. And I want to just once again thank Michael O'Brien for inspiring and thinking hard and thinking clear and being such a great conversation partner. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming. 80-something people, that's amazing.
Yeah, everyone have a great night, and we'll send out a list of resources in the next day or two. So thank you to all.